I'm sure everyone in this room at one point or another has thought that their vote could not possibly matter. No matter who they vote for, in the end of the day, none of it matters and we should just not bother with voting. And this is the very real mentality that plagues many Americans and convinces them not to take part in any of our elections. And this forsakes one of the most important tools that they have to make a difference. In the end, it is not just about voting for whoever becomes the president, but it is voting for all levels of government, local, state, and federal. And what we do is say, as the American people, does actually in fact matter. With the amount of negative news coverage that we see from both sides of the argument, it's easy to get disenfranchised and think that nothing you do matters. But as an individual growing up in a very individualistic society, we all have this idea that we can impact our environment in huge ways, but we just don't know how to accomplish it. And what I want to tell you is that being an informed voter is the most important thing you can do. And it's all about the numbers. The more of us vote, the more the politicians will actually listen to us. While our democracy-based systems and voting systems are not perfect, being an informed voter is a critical way to make your voice known. When we combine high voter turnout with an awareness of the issues that affect us, it helps keep our politicians honest and accountable, and we will force them to pay attention to their constituents. So why vote personally? For those who go actually vote on a consistent basis, thank you. But for the rest of you, I get it. You have a busy life. Maybe you don't think you have time to vote, but maybe you do. So I've heard plenty of arguments and attitudes about voting, and I would like to call attention to a few of these. The first one that I've heard is that my vote does not matter, and that's just absolutely not true. I'm going to point out to a couple of very close encounters that just actually happened just recently in 2018. DJ Johnson and Jim Glenn. In 2018, in Kentucky, Jim Glenn defeated former Republican State Representative DJ Johnson by one vote. And when they did a recanvass of the voting, they actually were counting invalid ballots originally that hadn't counted the first time. In 2017, Republican David Yancey was only ahead by 11 votes, and then when a recount happened, it actually showed that Shelley Simmons was ahead by one vote. And to actually decide the winner, they pulled out the names out of a hat to see who would actually win the House of Delegates election. So, and with these elections, only about 47% of voters actually voted. So can you imagine how many more votes and how the voters would have turned if more people had actually voted? So this brings up another thing. Does people think that only presidential elections matter? And that's actually simply not true. In your local community, elections happen all the time. And most of the time, when you actually go to a voting booth, you'll have a list of names and issues that are at hand. A month before that, you can actually opt in for the practice ballot, and you can vote and research ahead of time. So that way you know what's coming up, and you can look at your representatives, because everybody has a Facebook group, and everybody has a website that they're taking care of. You can always find information on any candidates or issues that you're seeing. So what about the rest of the world? How do they feel about voting? Well, Belgium and Sweden both have very, very high voter turnouts at 87.2% for Belgium and Sweden 82.6%, but that's also because they have mandatory voting. In South Korea, they do not have mandatory voting, but there's 77.9%. We are all the way down to the bottom at 55.7% of that. And out of that 55.7% of that, most of them are above the age of 65. And because of that, there's actually a very disproportionate voters. From 18 to 24, there's actually only 15 million active voters. So if I'm a politician, I want to go for the older voters. I want to listen to them, because in the end, they're the ones that are going to get me elected. And if we want our issues known as younger people, we all need to go out and vote. If we can show support, politicians will listen to us. So that brings me my last misconception, that it is all rigged anyway. And that's not necessarily true. You've heard about gerrymandering, and these are gerrymandered districts. That is to be happen. But the best thing you can do to fight against gerrymandering is to just go out and vote. Right now, these borders are drawn by people who are currently active voters. If we can go out and vote more, that means that those boundaries will no longer exist. If you vote red or blue, those boundaries would have to be redrawn, because there'd just be too many people and too many numbers to account for that. It just won't work anymore. So, this was actually pointed out in the Washington Post article too, that they think recently the Washington Post actually showed an article that Michigan had created a independent group to draw districts, and unfortunately, the representatives of that group opposed the measure. The problem with gerrymandering is that whoever's in power gets to draw the districts. So, unfortunately, there's very little incentive to actually change gerrymandering until we actually clamor about it. So we have to go out and vote, and we have to go out and tell our representatives. So the last thing is, call your representatives. You need to call your representatives, because if a bunch of people call the representatives at the same time, that means they're going to rethink their actions. They're going to take that seriously. We need to show either support or we need to condemn our representatives on a consistent basis and keep them honest. So, in short, what can you do about this overwhelming situation? Well, go out and vote. Like I said, the best way to combat gerrymandering is to vote. To also, about, if you want to take care of like shortage of polling stations or anything else, talk to your representatives. Make sure this is something that they know that you are passionate about. Because in the end, they will only be as honest as we let them be. And if you can't do this, again, sign up for the practice ballots, mail-in voting, do early voting as much as possible. Get away from the excuses that we have, because the long lines of voting day is just the amount of people that have to do this at the last minute. There are plenty of resources to do this beforehand. So, in conclusion, being an informed voter in this day and age is so important. And technology is constantly evolving every day, and we have so much information at our fingertips. There is absolutely no excuse anymore to be an uninformed voter. So now that you know all this, how many of you are ready to volunteer for your local government or political campaigns that are happening in your area? Well, if you can't do that, can you be an informed voter who pays attention to their community governments? Whether you choose, remember that changes will take time in election cycles. It's never going to happen overnight. So only with consistent participation will we be able to secure a voice for representation in the future. Remember what our forefathers originally went to war for. We remember taxation, we forget about representation. Whatever you vote, red, blue, or independent, make sure you are voting for a representative who wants to fight for your values and what you want to see happen in our government.